Okay. Good evening. Welcome, alumni and friends of Hiram College, to our Views from the Hill, our election panel discussion hosted at the City Club of Cleveland. My name is John Coyne. I am the Director of Alumni Relations at Hiram College. I'm also a graduate of Hiram from the class of 1995. I'd like to thank you for taking a break from the endless cable news and social media campaign machine to hear some Hiram perspectives on the upcoming presidential election. Our program features 3 members of Hiram's distinctive faculty who will each give an election-related presentation. Following their presentations, they will take Q&A from the audience. Tonight's panelists are Douglas M. Bradabo, Associate Professor of Political Science, Vivian E. Sandland, Professor of History, and James Thompson, Associate Professor of Political Science. So, at this time, I'd like to welcome Professor Bradabo to the podium.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight, and thanks so much for consenting to spend a little bit of time with the 3 of us. So it turns out that there's going to be a presidential election soon. Who knew? Who knew? It's only been 3 years in the making. And the slice of that presidential election about which I'd like to speak to you tonight involves demographics and the way the country is changing and what that means for the political parties of the United States of America. And I think in those demographic changes, one sees all at once both rather remarkable, constructive, and beautiful things happening on the one hand, but also threatening, dangerous, and challenging things happening on the other. And so to talk about the state of the 2 political parties in light of really remarkable lightning-quick change within the population of the United States, I begin with this slide, which is the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 by Lyndon Johnson. It was one of the greatest moments in American history. This was the Republic realizing its full promise after a civil war more than a century before. And long before that, the framing of a declaration whose meaning would not be fixed for all time, but as Lincoln put it at the time of the Civil War, would be capable of evolution. And the country would therefore reach vistas that it had not even envisioned at the time, but it would subsume those into the meaning of the Declaration of Independence. But in this picture, you see Dr. King right behind the president, and you see Lyndon Johnson doing what presidents do, and that is handing out pens, where they use a pen on one letter or so, and then they give it away for a souvenir, and it comes to be worth not only symbolism, but also worth real dollars as a souvenir in decades to come. But at the very last of giving away of these pens, Lyndon Johnson turned to the recipient behind him, and he said, and I quote, "There goes the South for a generation." Now, he was on the right track, but what he might as well have said is, for the Democratic Party, the formerly solid Democratic South up into the 1960s, there goes the South for 2 to 3 generations. That would have been the accurate descriptor. And if you look across the former Confederate states today, from the governorship to Senate seats to United States House seats to seats in the State House and the State Senate, you find Republican dominance. Now, the story of how that Republican dominance was born and how it is carried forward in that region to the present day has a lot to do with the demographic changes in this country. There's a complex interrelationship there, and so I want to spend a few minutes talking about those. In 1968, running for president for the second time, Richard Nixon hatched what he called his Southern strategy, his law and order strategy, his silent majority strategy. And the calculus was this: white people in the South do not like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, they do not like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and if the Republican Party can go to this fertile medium of people who are upset with the Democratic Party and get particularly Southern white males to become Republican voters, then we can elect a lot of presidents in the coming years. And indeed, that is precisely what the Republican Party managed to do. It was a brilliant political sleight of hand. It was first-rate strategy, but it assumed that the United States would be an 80% plus white country forever. And no one at that time foresaw us becoming what we will be by the year 2043, and I'll say more about that in a little bit, and that is a minority-majority country. Now, By 1992, when Bill Clinton would be elected president, the Democratic Party had lost the popular vote in 5 out of 6 presidential elections. And here I move to the next slide, which is this book, The Emerging Republican Majority, published by Kevin Phillips, the political commentator who I think is still alive and well today. He's written a number of other very insightful, excellent books, and I would recommend them. In this book, he said, it may not feel like it. It may feel like the Great Society years of Lyndon Johnson are just concluding and that the country is going to be moving in that direction for a long time. But he said, I think by 1980, on the basis of this election victory by Richard Nixon, we will see a rightward shift in the politics of the United States of America. And indeed, that came to pass in the form of the Reagan Revolution, as it came to be known, in 1980. And what Kevin Phillips said in this book was that essentially white guys in the suburbs, and particularly in the South, would come to feel very at home voting for Republican presidents for a period of time, and that would be the reason that Nixon's victory in 1968 was the beginning of something, not a blip, not an aberration, not the end of anything, but the beginning of a political tide in this country. Now, this guy we know. He looks a little older right now. He is, I think, one of the behemoths of American politics, but you see him standing behind a podium here that says DLC on it. That's the Democratic Leadership Council, an organization that he created in the early 1980s and which worked like crazy for a period of 8 years to retool, refit, and redesign the Democratic Party to bring it to the political center, so that it could elect Democratic presidents again. And it did several things. On policy, it tried to move the Democratic Party toward free trade, to become harsher on criminals and on sentencing and on crime, the genesis of 3 strikes and you're outlaws as they would come to be known, to be more muscular in foreign policy, willing to use force. Those were among the changes, including fiscal prudence and the desire to balance the budget, which you didn't hear, George McGovern in 1972 talk a lot about in the Democratic Party. Those were the ideas that the DLC sought to implant within the mainstream of the Democratic Party. It took those ideas, it gave them to House and Senate candidates. They went out there and they won a few elections, and then they said, we need someone to run for the presidency with these ideas. Now, you know Bill Clinton, and you know that when he formed the DLC, it was always clear to him who the messenger would be. Once those ideas were generated, once they'd been road tested, it would be time for Bill Clinton to run for the presidency of the United States. And indeed, in 1992, for the first time, and for re-election in 1996, after a very rough first half of his first term, Bill Clinton won the White House. And this was the fruit that was born by the Democratic Leadership Council's efforts to reform for 8 years in the 1980s. Now, that brings us to this book, The Emerging Democratic Majority, published by John B. Judas and Roy Teixeira in 2002. And in this book, they said, wow, things feel kind of conservative in American politics these days, but we look ahead to 2008 and we will go out on a limb and we will make this prediction that this country is going to move leftward, back toward the political center, that this will first manifest in 2008, but that there is a long-term prospect here for the Democratic Party again to be able to elect presidents of the United States. Now, we've got to look for a second here, I think, at the ideas that Judas and Teixeira expressed. And their ideas revolved around what they called a progressive centrist coalition. They saw that as a rising coalition in American politics. The name that would be attached to it in subsequent years would be the Coalition of the Ascendant. They said that this would consist of African American voters, Latino American voters, Asian American voters, to a less decisive degree, women, and particularly single women, and millennials would be at the heart of this coalition as they rose into the voting pool. Now, it's safe to say that since that time, LGBT voters have been added to that coalition as well. All of those groups, as we'll see in a few slides from now, are reliable pillars of that Democratic coalition. This coalition, these authors said, would reside in what they referred to as ideopolises. That is, cities attached to suburbs, the populated corridors that ran between cities and suburbs, that would be the territory of this coalition of the ascendant. And indeed, if you look at the zip code map of voting in the last couple of presidential elections, and I would argue to a significant degree if you look at it again in a few weeks, you will find that blue is an urban and suburban phenomenon and that it moves through the populated corridors that connect those nodes, that exurbs and rural areas and many small towns are red. Right? And that has become the established pattern of the American politics these days. Now, the last thing I'll say about that book is that they noted that the members of this coalition would be cemented together not just because they were in favor of certain policies, but because they were against certain things. So if candidates said, well, let's get rid of the Environmental Protection Agency, let's not protect clean air and clean water, or let's abolish the Education Department, or let's get rid of Social Security, they would recoil from such proposals, and that would further cement them together. In other words, the more extreme propositions became in opposition to their beliefs, the tighter the glue would be that would hold them together. Now, here is the famous first page of one of the Pew Research Center reports. It's on the demographic future of the country. And Pew has been all over this for a period of years now. I think that front page is from 2008 in the credits there. But the cake is already baked demographically for the United States that tells us that by 2042, 2043, we are going to become a minority-majority country. Now, back to 1968 and Nixon's Southern strategy. It was great to dominate the electoral map with loyalty from white male voters, particularly in the South and the High Plains states, with that L of Republican states running from the Canadian border all the way south to Texas and all the way east to the eastern seaboard, with nearly 200 electoral votes wrapped up in the bag every time. But it assumed that the country would not begin to do what these reports tell us is well underway and is going to culminate in 2042 or 2043. There was nobody in 1968 talking about that. And in that sense, this neat strategic Republican trick of becoming dominant by attracting the Southern white male was a poison pill. The party could stomach it for a while, but as the country changed, then the Republican Party would be at the horns of a big strategic dilemma. Now, this slide is of the Growth and Opportunity Project, so titled by the Republican National Committee. There you see it with its fancy computer-generated generic title page. I'm no artist, but I could do that, ladies and gentlemen. I'm confident. I know I could. All right. So there it is. It was released in December of 2012. Reince Priebus, the Republican National Committee chairman, brought it out. It's online. It's a PDF. You can go read it. Here, I think, is a title page from it. And if you look at the sections of this report, for instance, in demographics, which is section 4 there, it lists the different parts of the coalition of the ascendant. And what it says is, hey, guys, please stop being rude to people who aren't old and white. Please be nice. Please play well with diverse America. Please entertain arguments that disagree with your own. And let's not get boxed into the same place that we got in 2008 and 2012. Let's be careful to avoid that. And then candidates started to run for the 2016 cycle, about 16 of them, and they went out there in primaries, and they found, among others, 13 million people who were going to vote for somebody who made the kinds of statements that Donald Trump now has made for well over a year. And every time he made one of those statements, you can imagine the reaction of Reince Priebus just sort of pulling on his hair and saying, oh my God, this only ends one way. This is a disaster for the Republican Party. And yet, an awful lot of Republican officials and Republican politicians somehow managed to talk themselves into tolerating Donald Trump or to endorsing him or to giving him some sort of limited pass on the kinds of remarks he was making. Now, this brings us to the individual components of the coalition of the ascendant, and I want to look at a little bit of data here. So this first slide is the white vote as a percentage of the whole in presidential elections from 1980 to 2012, right? This year, it will be probably about 69%, maybe it could be as high as 69.5%, but really what it's doing is it's following almost 1 percentage point a year, and it's just going to keep doing that all the way out into the 2040s, all right? So what I take from that is that in addition to this debate that's been taking place among political analysts and political scientists, can a Republican candidate win the presidency by maximizing the white vote and finding these white missing voters out there? Donald Trump is the test case for that. He's going to lose very, very badly in early November. And when he loses very, very badly in early November, the lie will be put to that proposition. There aren't enough missing white voters in this country that if you ramp them all up and get them angry and outraged and they turn out, that they're going to produce anything like an electoral majority. That's not going to happen, all right? So that would be the sort of first comment on the components of this coalition. Second, Asian American voters. Here we see data from 1992 to 2012. Look at the yawning gap by the time you get to 2012. That will be bigger this time around. That will be a lot bigger this time around. One of the discussions about why this pattern has developed is not only about tolerance and about treating different groups of Americans with respect, but it's about the importance of education to a lot of people who happen also to be Asian Americans. And when they hear uneducated statements, it makes them very uneasy about having leaders with powers vested in their hands if they don't seem to know what they're talking about. Okay, next. This is African American voter analysis, and it runs all the way from 1936 to the present day. And it's in two categories. And the first category is black party affiliation. Remember that in the early part of the 20th century, right, the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, was the party of civil rights. It led the charge for anti-lynching laws in the 1920s, for instance, and actually got them legislated. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had significant Republican support. But over time, and particularly from 1960 forward, very few African Americans have affiliated formally with the Republican Party. Concomitant with that has been the trend of African Americans voting 95, 94, 96% for the Democratic presidential candidate. And it's not just a thing that is relevant to Barack Obama's 2 election victories. It is the case, for instance, if you look here at Michael Dukakis, right, or Walter Mondale, they're knocking it out of the park with about 90% of the African American vote, which I find rather striking. So this is a long-term structural thing at this point. Doesn't mean it's permanent, but it is relatively affixed. Next, the Hispanic vote in presidential elections from 1980 to the present time, and the table below it, the percentage point gap between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, 44 percentage points. Huge. That will be bigger this time. All right, if you kick off your campaign and very early on it, you refer to Latino Americans as rapists, murderers, and I don't know, maybe some of them I assume are good people, then good luck. Good luck with that, all right? So we know that 44 will be a higher number this time around. And this, to me, is in some ways the most important data slide. And this is Latino participation in presidential elections of Latino Americans who are citizens and completely eligible to vote, right? This is the huge gap between, on the one hand, being eligible to vote and being registered to vote and participating. This is the sleeping giant of the electorate, and nowhere is it more important than in the state of Texas. Jeremy Byrd, who was in the analytics shop for Obama in 2008, decamped to Texas after 2012, the re-election victory. He started an organization called Battleground Texas. You can go look at its website. Block by block, building by building, apartment by apartment, Battleground Texas is registering every Hispanic voter in Texas with the assumption that if they break 3-1 or 4-1 in favor of the Democrats whenever they begin to vote, that will flip Texas to Democratic. Now, what I would say to you is there's something very interesting happening. If you look at Arizona, if you look at Georgia today, the polls in Arizona and Georgia are very close in this presidential election. Nate Silver yesterday moved Arizona to just slightly blue. If that happens, that would be the first time since 1964 that a Democratic presidential candidate won the state of Arizona. But the bigger picture is that in 2020, 2024, 2028, all of those states are going to vote for a Democratic presidential candidate of one time or one kind or another. May not all happen in 1 year. They may not all break at once. They may go back and forth. But those states are going to be won by a Democratic presidential candidate again. I'll give you one more statistic pertaining to this slide. In 2012, the number of Hispanic voters in Texas who were eligible to vote but didn't vote was bigger than the gap that separated Mitt Romney and Barack Obama in the total number of popular votes. All right? That can't last forever. That's not sustainable. There is going to be, I think, a big set of changes in states that have that pattern. And here you see, in battleground states, the percentage of the electorate actually casting ballots self-identified as Hispanic voters. If you look from New Mexico and Arizona to Nevada, Florida, Colorado, and the U.S. average, Virginia, North Carolina, the trend is very clear. The trend is only going to accelerate. It's going to accelerate more rapidly in some places than it is in others, but the handwriting is there, it is on the wall, and it could not be more clear. All right, here is a slide that shows the growth in the quote-unquote Obama coalition from 2008 to 2012 in key states. Here again, when you look at the increase in the minority share of the vote, the college white share of the vote, and the non-college white share of the vote, you see something very striking. In places where Hillary Clinton is polling pretty well in the battleground states, she tends to do better where these changes are more pronounced. She tends to do a little less better where they've been less pronounced. Where is the race closest at the present moment? My home state of Iowa. Why? Look at the very small growth in the Obama coalition components there. Less than 1 percentage point in 4 years, probably between 2012 and 2016. It will not be any more rapid than that. Now, I want to talk about the meaning of this and the importance to the political parties, and I want to tell you what to look for in the next 4 years as you keep an eye out for what American politics will look like. The Republican Party has moved itself inadvertently into an existential threat. Its brand is going to be around. The question is, what is that brand going to be? What is going to subsume that brand as its banner? Which faction within it will compete successfully and become the dominant successor faction? Is it Trumpism? Is it something around Paul Ryan? Is it something we can't even identify or name yet or give an ideological credo to? All of those things are certainly possible. But here's a note of caution for the Democratic Party, the National Committee, and the Democratic Party organization. Political parties make their biggest fatal errors when they're on top. When you think life is good and you start to win presidential elections and you win 3 in a row, or maybe 4 or 5, like in the New Deal, passing forward to Harry Truman for the Democrats, that's when you do stupid things. That's when you overreach. That's when you screw up. That's when you miscalculate. You can already see within the Democratic Party a schism developing between the Bernieites, right, farther out on the left, and the establishment. That's going to take real care and feeding and attention and creativity over the next 4 years so that that does not become some sort of Grand Canyon by 2020. It is also, I think, worth remembering that new political coalitions, when they emerge and when they come to fruition, they stay glued together in part through economic growth. So if you're Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton, you had to think a few days ago when we found out that the middle class income grew at 5% for the calendar year 2015, the fastest in well over a generation, when the poverty rate came down by a full percentage point, that bodes well for the holding together of that Democratic coalition. But of course, there's no guarantee that that economic growth is going to continue consistently. Now, we then look ahead to a time when both political parties are going to have fissures. The question is, will the Democratic Party's fissures become as significant and potentially fatal as those affecting the Republican Party have become, or will they not develop quite to that extent? At the end of the day, in 2020 and beyond, it takes 2 functioning parties in the United States to govern this country. And they must believe in the fundamental things that enabled the framers to create our civic republic and allowed us to navigate the gravest shoals in the history of the republic: bargaining, negotiation, compromise, respect, civility. Those things have to be manifest in both political parties, and both political parties must work. If they do not, the future looks an awful lot, legislatively speaking, like the last 6 years, where Congress cannot walk and chew gum at the same time. It can't pass a budget every year. It can't keep the government open or any of those things. So, despite the rather gloomy data for the Republican Party in the near and intermediate term, I am pulling for the Republican Party. I want it to be, again, the party of Lincoln, the party of Theodore Roosevelt, the party of Dwight Eisenhower, and even the party of Ronald Reagan, who, of course, is so reasonable in retrospect that he couldn't possibly run in Republican primaries and get votes today. He'd do crazy things like compromise or bargain or negotiate or be nice to people. So, with all of that in mind, I will pass it now to my wonderful colleague, and that is Vivian Sandlin.
Thank you, Doug. I enjoyed that so much because I think our talks complement each other. And this is not a conspiracy. We had no idea what the other people were going to say tonight. So enjoying the election so far. We actually are in the election. I voted yesterday. Early voting has started in Ohio. And I was very excited about going out and voting on the first day of early voting. So I feel like I've done my civic duty. I don't think we're heading in the direction of civility at the moment. I don't think so. Well, on September, I have to get onto my, PowerPoint here. Oop, wait a second.
I think it's deep. We've got one more.
Aha, there we go. All right, you can see my title here. On September 25th, back before the first presidential debate, and it seems a lifetime ago, the New York Times ran an article about the divisions between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump over race and gender. The article said, in a campaign that has veered from traditional policy arguments toward a battle over national identity and values, Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Trump are more sharply opposed over racial and gender issues than any two presidential opponents in decades. Even in other times of social unrest, few, if any, presidential candidates have constructed their political arguments around themes of race, gender, and cultural diversity as much as Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Trump. The common wisdom, which we hear regularly in news analyses of the candidates, is that Hillary Clinton voters are likely to be racial and ethnic minorities, as you suggested, and educated white women in the suburbs. The Trump vote, according to the common wisdom, is strongest among non-college educated working-class white men who are angry over loss of jobs and lack of economic opportunity. And indeed, a stereotype of Trump voters has emerged. I recently attended a Hillary Clinton rally in Akron, and circling the venue were several giant pickup trucks driven by white men and displaying huge signs that read "Hillary for prison" and "Trump her." This seemed to exhibit the stereotype right there on the street. Now, as a student of race and gender in U.S. political history, I'm fascinated by this division in this presidential election that seems to be less over conservative versus liberal ideology than over identity and issues surrounding identity. That's a creepy slide. Donald Trump has promised that we will take our country back, apparently from undocumented immigrants and from perceived threats from Muslim refugees, and possibly from others. Hillary Clinton has promised that we are stronger together, though she once also referred to half of Trump supporters as occupying a basket of deplorables. We'll remember that. We seem to be divided over whose country this is. Votes being divided by race and gender are nothing new. In the years before the ratification of the 19th Amendment, some women's suffrage activists proclaimed that women's votes would clean up politics and create a better world thanks to women's higher moral nature. Opponents of women's suffrage also predicted that women would change voting, though not for the good. The liquor industry fretted that if women won the vote, prohibition could not be far behind. They poured money into advertising portraying voting women as forcing men into subservient roles as homemakers. And ironically, the Prohibition Amendment to the Constitution was ratified before the Women's Suffrage Amendment gave women the right to vote nationwide. The promises and warnings of women changing politics by voting, of course, failed to materialize. The 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, and women voted that year. The ensuing years were not ones in which politics grew cleaner and better. The administration of Warren Harding of Ohio was marred by scandal and is remembered today for corruption. When women won the vote nationwide, they tended to vote as their husbands did, out of interests of class and region and ethnic identification. Women did not start voting for Democrats in consistently higher numbers until the late 20th century. African American men briefly had the right to vote in the South during Reconstruction. They understandably supported the Republican Party. This was, as Doug said, the party of Lincoln, the party that had led the fight to end slavery, the party that had pushed through the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery after the Civil War. The Republican Party had also pushed through the 14th Amendment, authored by Ohio Congressman John Bingham, which effectively overturned the ruling in the Dred Scott case that no black person was a citizen, and which aimed to prevent states from denying equal rights to any person. The Republican Party had also pushed through the 15th Amendment, which prohibited states from denying the vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. From the 1870s on, Southern states passed laws requiring the payment of poll taxes, or requiring literacy tests to vote, or stipulating that a man could vote only if his grandfather had voted. And so the Democrats in the South snatched away from African Americans the right to vote. World War I brought the great migration of African Americans out of the South and into the North, where African Americans could vote. Their allegiance was still mostly with the Republicans. Then in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the allegiance of African Americans who could vote began to shift from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. These were mostly Northern African Americans, such as the people from Alabama who had moved to Cleveland to take factory jobs and who could now vote. To these Northern black voters, the Republican Party, with its support of business interests, began no longer appearing to represent their interests as working-class people. By 1936, African American voters had begun to put their faith in Franklin Roosevelt, the architect of a New Deal for the American people. They began to shift into the Democratic Party to become part of the New Deal coalition of voters. The irony of this is that African American voters joined the same party that was the home of white Southerners who stood staunchly in favor of segregation and of maintaining the restrictions on voting in the South that continued to exclude black voters. This perhaps helps to explain the refusal of President Franklin Roosevelt to support a federal anti-lynching bill. President Roosevelt did not want to alienate white Southern Democratic leaders in Congress who had the power to undermine his New Deal legislation. After World War II, most African American voters were committed Democrats. This is a slide similar to the ones you put up. And they've remained Democrats by wide margins to this day. And since World War II, the race gap in voting between the parties has been greater than the gender gap in voting, particularly among African American voters. Women in the 1950s actually voted in greater percentages for Republicans than men did. And it was not until 1980 that a higher percentage of women than men began to vote consistently for Democratic candidates in presidential elections. And since 1980, Latinos have consistently voted for Democrats over Republicans, again, as you suggested. And the Pew Research Center reports that Hillary Clinton currently leads Donald Trump by a wide margin. With that historical background, let's turn to the current election. I've always been skeptical of the common wisdom about who supports whom in this election, particularly the common wisdom regarding who supports Donald Trump. Are his supporters really mainly displaced and angry white working-class men who have been struggling economically? What is this Trump movement? Who supports it and why? Hillary supporters seem easier to identify, but I want to understand who they are also. So I went in search of data to answer my question about who supports whom, particularly who supports the Trump movement. And I found some recent data from surveys that drilled down into the nature of candidate support. The data I found on Hillary Clinton supporters largely confirms the common wisdom, the popular notions of who her supporters are. But the data on Trump supporters challenges the common wisdom and the Trump supporter stereotype. So there was an interesting article in the Atlantic magazine in late September, which attempted to drill down into who the Clinton supporters were, but especially into who the Trump supporters were, by looking more deeply into the racial characteristics, education, economic background, and gender. And they came up with some interesting data using a study. And this first slide shows you the differences between Clinton and Trump voters by race. As you can see, 38% of Clinton supporters are minorities, including Latinos. 62% of Clinton supporters are white, non-Latinos. Only 9% of Trump supporters are minorities, including Latinos. 91% of Trump supporters are white. So again, 91% of Trump supporters are white. Now that tends to confirm the common wisdom, the stereotype of Trump supporters. Then the study looked at Clinton and Trump supporters by education. And you can see the data here. 37% of Clinton supporters have at least a bachelor's degree. 29% of Trump supporters have at least a bachelor's degree. 63% of Clinton supporters have no bachelor's degree, and 71% of Trump supporters have no bachelor's degree. So again, that seems to confirm the common wisdom about Trump supporters, that they are white and fewer of them have bachelor's degrees than do Clinton supporters. They tend to be white and people without bachelor's degrees. Then the study looked at Clinton and Trump supporters by race and education. And we see that 27% of Clinton supporters are white people with a bachelor's degree, and 10% are minorities with a bachelor's degree. 28% of Trump supporters are white people with a bachelor's degree, and 1% of Trump supporters are minorities with a bachelor's degree. So 35% of Clinton supporters are white people with no bachelor's degree. 28% of Clinton supporters are minorities with no bachelor's degree. 63% of Trump supporters are white people with no bachelor's degree, and 8% of Trump supporters are minorities with no bachelor's degree. Then we mix in gender. So far, the stereotype of Trump supporters, or the common wisdom, seems to be holding, but then we mix in gender. And this is interesting. 35% of Trump supporters are white women without a bachelor's degree, whereas only 28% of Trump supporters are white men without a bachelor's degree. Now let's look at the economic data. And here's where you may be shocked. The median household income for Trump supporters in 2015 was $71,000 a year. The median household income for Clinton supporters was $10,000 a year less, at $61,000 a year. In other words, Trump supporters are not overwhelmingly poor people. They're not necessarily struggling economically. Another study that was done by a senior economist at the Gallup organization looked at some of these issues as well. The question of whether Trump supporters are primarily the stereotype. He looked specifically at Trump supporters, whether they're the stereotype of poor white men who are economically disadvantaged and feeling angry because they don't have opportunities. And what this study found is that really was not the case. There was no correlation between the income of Trump supporters and the income of people and their likelihood to be Trump supporters. This study also found something else that was very interesting. It found that, and this was based on several months of interviews with, and using Gallup data, Gallup microdata. And what this study found is that Trump supporters overwhelmingly tended to be racially isolated. Now, what did that mean? It means that they tend to be white people who live around other white people and have very little contact with minorities or immigrants. I mean, it's true, they say over in surveys, they say they're against, undocumented immigrants, and they're very angry about undocumented immigrants, and this was common, but they don't live around undocumented immigrants or around many immigrants at all. They tend to be white people siloed with other white people, which I think is a fascinating piece of data. And I think it complements what you're saying, Doug, about sort of the changing demographics. I have a hypothesis that I'd like to advance to you. And the hypothesis is that Trump supporters that the Trump movement, let me put it that way, the Trump movement is not really an economic movement, but rather it's a cultural movement, a cultural backlash against the demographic and social changes that have taken place over the past 20 or 30 years. That it's a resistance to what's been called the browning of America, immigration, the perceived threat from Muslim refugees from the other. It's a backlash against the other. And I think what you're talking about, the changing demographics, supports this. Now, I'm not saying that all Trump supporters think this or feel this way, but I think many of them do. And also the growing political power of minorities and women. I think it's a backlash against that as well. I've heard that trending on Twitter these days is repeal the 19th Amendment, which is the amendment that gave women the right to vote, right? And so, I guess that leaves us with a question. I mean, is this phenomenon of angry people, angry white people, calling for, locking Hillary, the opponent up, lock her up, and chanting, build that wall. Is this what we're going to be seeing for the foreseeable future? Or is there a chance to is there a chance to bring people together again? And I don't know the answer to that. I really don't know the answer to that. I'm a historian, and historians don't usually make predictions. I mean, I know you predicted who's going to win the race. We historians don't make so many predictions. But I do think that there is hope that if we expand education of the kind we have at Hiram and extend it to more people, education that calls for civility and for interacting with others who are different and learning to understand others who are different. If we can do that, then perhaps we can overcome the anger and resentment and bitterness that people feel over new people coming into the country that threaten them, that they feel threaten them. Perhaps we'll be less threatened. And so I don't mean to sound too sunny and optimistic, but maybe that's a possibility. I don't want to sound partisan, but Hillary Clinton's theme, her slogan now is "Stronger Together," and I think she's on to something. That if we work together or try to work together and do it in a civil way, if we consciously and intentionally work to have civil dialogue and discourse, that perhaps things can get better. Thank you.
All right. Now for something completely different. So my talk is Pangloss, Pericles, and Presidential Leadership in the Unipolar Moment. And this is a Hiram crowd, so I expect some of you actually know what that might mean. I want to start out with a general question. And the question is, do you think U.S. national security is increasing or decreasing? Please raise your hand if you think it's decreasing. We're getting less secure as time goes by. Raise your hand if you actually think that's true. Okay, raise your hand if you think we're becoming more secure as time goes by. Okay, that's a very interesting majority. Most audiences, I would expect to say, we're becoming less secure. And the reason I'd expect people to say that is we've got people blowing things up in the United States, we have the Middle East in free fall, we have Russia and China who are becoming more assertive, and people are getting nervous, and that's understandable. So my next question, who is Dr. Pangloss? Hiram-educated people, I believe in you. Who is Dr. Pangloss? Yes, here we go.
Okay. My memory is, but it's from a long time ago, that he said we have to, this is the best of all possible worlds.
This is the best of all possible worlds and the best of all possible times, and everything's for the best of the best of the best. That's what Dr. Pangloss said. And I'm about to give a presentation that's going to sound like Dr. Pangloss. I'm not suggesting that things are going well. I'm going to make an argument, which is that the United States, globally speaking, is as secure as it's ever been. It's actually in a remarkably secure position relative to its own history, relative to other countries and their histories. We're in an amazing place right now. And that it's useful to think about that when we hear candidates say their positions regarding foreign policy. If we're going to analyze those positions, we need to match them up with the reality that is. And I'm going to suggest to you that the reality that is, from the point of view of American national security, remarkable in terms of its fortuitousness. I say that for two reasons. When you think of the major states or collections of states that could challenge the United States in terms of power, those other entities, either groupings or individual states, have experienced things that have made them far less capable recently to challenge the United States effectively. And the second thing I would say is that ideologically, the countries that pose the biggest ideological threat to the United States are in chaos internally across the board, and therefore can't serve as a springboard to challenge the United States that way. So let's start with the Western Hemisphere. Start with an easy question. Who's the guy on the top left? Raul Castro. Has anyone been to Cuba? Okay, you've been. Some of you have been with me. That's right. That's right. I've been there. They went with the Garfield Center for Public Leadership, by the way. I've been there 3 times. The most recent time was 2015. And I can tell you that these streets of Havana are packed with American tourists spending money buying things that the Cubans are extremely happy to sell them. The idea that Cuba is ever again going to pose as an ideological challenger to the United States is over. And if that's upsetting to you, well, I'm sorry to break that news, but that is true. Who's the guy in the middle? Maduro, right. Nicolas Maduro, who is the president of Venezuela, which has been trying to set itself up as the new Cuba in terms of opposing American ideology, a strong bastion of socialist success. And if you know anything about what's going on right now in Venezuela, you know that that country is economically collapsing. They are having riots in the streets for things like toilet paper. It is very scary. And the chance of them, therefore, presenting an ideological alternative to the U.S. agenda is just not there. Who's the third guy? Who's the third photograph? Yeah, Evo Morales from... Actually, no, excuse me, that's wrong. But I so wanted it to be true. No, this is Evo Morales from Bolivia. And Evo was sort of the next tier down in terms of people in this hemisphere who are opposing the American agenda. Not as vigorously as these other guys, but he's of note. He just he tried to get a vote passed in his country that would allow him to stay in office for another term, a third term. That did not succeed. He will soon be leaving, which is to say that all the major notable ideological challenges in the Western Hemisphere are disappearing to the U.S. agenda of capitalism and free markets. That is useful for American strength, that's useful for American security, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A if you want to. I'd also just note before we leave this region that Brazil a few years ago was considered to be the rising power. It's the B in that acronym BRICS, those countries that are coming onto the world scene and are going to challenge the single unipolar moment of the United States dominance. If you know anything about what's going on in Brazil right now, it's really quite unfortunate for Brazilians. I don't want Brazilians to suffer, but from the point of view of U.S. interest being able to secure itself rather unobstructedly in this region. The Western Hemisphere has never been this secure, not since the 1770s. It's remarkable. Okay, going across the Atlantic. So, a couple of things of note in Europe. First of all, European integration. Right. European integration. Stay with me. It's distracting. I know. I'm here. Focus on it. European integration is something the United States government loves. The United States has been one of the strongest supporters of European integration since it began in the 1950s. Why is that? European integration is there first and foremost to stop World War III from happening. And we like that kind of thing. Furthermore, it provides a very strong common market, good for U.S. as well, to have a good trading partner and so forth. There is one way in the near term that the British could have challenged the Europeans could have challenged American supremacy, and that is by providing an alternative financial capital to New York City. And that looked to be like something that might happen with London up until fairly recently. London was becoming this place that might actually overtake New York and become the place where capital goes to do what capital does. And then the British went and they did this funny little thing, which is they decided to leave the European Union. If the British had sat around for a decade trying to figure out how to destroy their chances of having London become the new New York global financial capital, they couldn't have come up with a better way to do that than what they did. If you've been looking at what's going on with the pound right now, with the British economy, that is all mounting evidence of that fact. So if you're American, you're thinking, what would I like Europe to look like? I'd like European integration to continue, European Union to be strong, and the British just to be taken down a peg so we don't have to compete with their financial capital. This is like manna from heaven. The other thing I would note is obviously the gentleman in the photographs. So Russia is there in Europe on the periphery of the European Union, and a lot of people think that Vladimir Putin, and of course that's Vladimir Putin, you can tell because he's not wearing a shirt. They think Vladimir Putin is a genius, strategically speaking, and someone who thinks that of him and thinks they want to promote that idea of him as all that he is. Photoshop, that's not a real photograph. Made that photograph of him shirtless riding a bear. The truth of the matter is that Vladimir Putin's real condition is better articulated or expressed by the lower photo, which is, again, Vladimir without a shirt, being chased by a bear that's about to eat him. And let me just give you one example of this, why we don't need to be afraid of Vladimir Putin. There's a country called Ukraine, which is right on the border of the European Union. Nothing could be less in the interest of Russia than to have Ukraine become part of the EU. And Vladimir engaged in precisely the exact actions you would need to guarantee that Ukraine would become part of the European Union. He put the screws on his puppet regime that was running that country so hard to keep them out of the European Union, he sparked a backlash against that regime. That guy, his president, his person, got kicked out of power. Vladimir, what did he do? He then went in and seized portions of Ukraine. Which portions? The parts with the most economically backward, which would keep Ukraine from qualifying for the EU, and the parts, the few of them, particularly in the south and Crimea, that would vote against European integration. All the rest of Ukraine is better off economically for the most part and wants to join the EU. And now because of Putin's actions, the EU is more receptive to that pitch. Simply put, Vladimir Putin shot himself in both feet by doing this. So that's Europe. Africa. I won't spend a lot of time on this other than to say that the major problem for the United States would be to have a situation of a pan-Islamic radical Islamist group, anti-American in its orientation, come to power and really corral a lot of groups in Africa to oppose U.S. interests. That's not going to happen. Just to give you a couple of most notable examples, we have Boko Haram in Nigeria and Al-Shabaab in Somalia. They are splintering internally, and they're also going and doing crazy things that will not earn them a lot of popularity, such as abducting large numbers of young girls. They are not going to form any pan-Islamic group of any radical, capable, anti-U.S. nature anytime soon. We don't have to worry about that. So meanwhile, in the Middle East, there is nothing I would love more than to have the Middle East be full of stable, democratic, free market states. But that's not what's going on. And that's not going to happen for a long time. The Middle East is in a terrible situation. and it's going to stay terrible. And if you're dealing with U.S. foreign policy, you have to deal with the facts as they are. And the fact is that what is in the U.S. strategic interest is to make sure that no political entity forms in that region so that it can get most of the people in that region behind it, project its agenda, and if it's an anti-American agenda or anti-Western agenda, anti-democratic, push that agenda outward beyond the region to other neighborhoods, eventually potentially to U.S. shores. The situation that exists in the Middle East is guaranteed to ensure that that sort of threat is not going to emerge for a very long time. And I'll just read this if you can't, and I'll have to look down at this, but this should give you a sense of where we are with the Middle East. So we remember Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was very scary, kind of still is. But they had an affiliate in Iraq, which eventually morphed into ISIS. ISIS broke away from Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda had an affiliate in Syria called the Nusra Front. The Nusra Front broke away from Al-Qaeda. ISIS, which broke away, and Nusra Front, which broke away, are now fighting each other. What do we got next? Both ISIS and Nusra Front are fighting the Syrian regime and the Turks and the Kurds. The Turks and the Kurds, as is their wont, are fighting each other. Hezbollah, which is right next door in in Lebanon, is fighting ISIS and Nusra Front. Iran is currently fighting ISIS and Nusra Front, and the Saudis are fighting the Yemenis, the Houthis in Yemen, and they are about to get into an arms race, a nuclear arms race potentially with Iran. Meanwhile, ISIS wants to launch attacks against Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is doing whatever it can to bring down the regime in Syria, which is fighting ISIS, which wants to bring down the Saudis. Which is to say that none of that is going to work itself out very soon, and that's tragic for the people who are there. But it's important for us to understand, because a lot of the fears Americans have about foreign policy and what's coming out of the Middle East, it's important to remember that although there are attacks being carried out in this country by people who affiliate with people from this region, what's going on in that region is not going to come and get us in any major way in terms of a country coming after us. Which brings us finally to the final region, which is Asia. China is the big issue on the horizon for U.S. foreign policy in terms of challenging U.S. supremacy and security. It's a big economy, growing military, huge population. And up until about 2010, it looked like that country was really playing its cards well. It was nurturing all these alliances with countries in its region, and it was developing its military in a way that wasn't overly provocative, but nonetheless really important. And then it did something kind of funny, which is it started to assert, and there are reasons for this, it's not simply irrational, but they decided to assert their claims to the South China Sea, and that's most notably demonstrated by their decision to build these sandbar islands. You can see them listed there around the Paracel and Spratly island chains, and station some moderately sized ships from their navy on those islands. Now, I'm not an expert when it comes to naval strategy or weaponry, so I talked to a guy who spent a career doing it, and I said, I'm not really seeing the strategic advantage of these islands. I don't think they're going to prevent the U.S. 7th Fleet from sailing around the Pacific there, and he agreed. They don't provide much strategic benefit. What they do is provide tremendous benefit for the United States. Essentially what's happened is the Chinese have moved too soon. They made a tremendous strategic blunder because by building these islands, they've outraged, antagonized the countries of their region to a degree that now all that careful diplomacy they had been engaging in to get these countries on their side has largely collapsed. And not only has it collapsed, but those countries in most respects are moving much closer to the United States. The United States almost just had to stand there in order to get allies because these states are moving away from the Chinese. As a result, very bizarre things are happening, such as the U.S. and the Vietnamese getting along ever better. The U.S. and India, which have always sort of had an arm's-length relationship, are now engaging in more naval activities than they ever have before in response to Chinese growth. And I could go on and on and on. So the Chinese basically destroyed is probably not too strong a word, most of their diplomatic gains that they'd been developing over time by doing this. They also moved too soon militarily. They do not have anywhere near the military capacity they would need to effectively challenge the U.S. and its allies in this region. If you see there in the top picture, that is their one and only currently functioning aircraft carrier. It's something they bought from the Ukrainians that I believe was built back in the 80s, and it runs on diesel. In this era of nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, that's not what you want. Now, they're building their first homegrown aircraft carrier, the 001A. That's when you know it's the first one. That's going to be a nuclear-powered ship, but it's going to be out on the water next year, which is interesting. But it's going to take a handful of years to get that integrated with a battle group, if I understand correctly. And even then, just to give you a sense of this, the U.S. 7th Fleet, which patrols that area, has at any one time at least one, and at any number of times 2 aircraft carriers in its command. That's not going to be competitive for the U.S. and all its allies. So I'm delighted. People get so angry about the Chinese building these islands, claiming this territory. I think go for it. You are doing the United States a tremendous favor by doing what you're doing, and I am far less nervous about China in the future than I was just a handful of years ago. I'm delighted with that leadership. Which brings me to my final slide and this guy. So again, Hiram audience, I have expectations. Who is this guy? Pericles, the other guy in my title, right? So you knew this was going to happen. Right, exactly. Of course, yeah. This is Pericles. Pericles was the leader of Athens back in the 400s BCE, when Athens was at the height of its democratic vitality and strength. And Pericles was a gentleman who advocated democracy passionately, gave the first great speech on behalf of democracy. But he was also no wilting flower when it came to foreign policy. He advocated strong engagement with the rest of the world because he knew, as he said to his fellow Athenians, even when they didn't want to hear it, it is dangerous to not engage. We cannot pull back from the world and hope it ignores us. We have to engage with it. Strong advocate of democracy, very strong advocate of a robust, engaging foreign policy. And he was extremely prudent, an extremely careful man. As a result, during his time, Athens thrived. He died, and after he was in power, people came to power who were far less capable, much more demagogic in their language, far less subtle, far less careful, far less prudent. And as a result, Athens blew it. It lost the Peloponnesian War, and when it went down hard. It essentially wiped out as a state in many respects, and with it went democracy. And that was basically it for democracy, with very minor exceptions, for about 2,000 years, until it showed up again in a robust form on the west or the east coast of North America. And my message here tonight is that we are in an incredibly unique moment in American history and world history. There has never been a country, and I don't say this to be jingoistic. In some ways, this makes me nervous. There has never been a country in history of the world that has been in this powerful, almost ideal Panglossian position of power relative to its other neighbors and other countries. And just like the Athenians, we could absolutely blow it. We could absolutely blow it. And when the Athenians went down, okay, a bunch of Greek city-states had to change their regime type. If the United States goes down, if we get out of control, if we do not play this role well, if we do not engage effectively and very thoughtfully, we could blow it. And the consequences for that are unimaginable. What we need is someone who can have the prudence, the clarity, the vigor, but also the subtlety of a Pericles. We really can't afford to not have that. The world can't afford to not have it. Whoever takes on the mantle of the presidency is going to inherit the world in a way no other human being has ever had, which is terrifying. So I guess I would leave on the note of the following point. We're going to have this election, and whoever's going to be elected is going to be elected. What I hope comes out of this election is that we're all chastened enough to recognize how important it is early on to get the kind of candidates we want in these parties at the head of the ticket so they can play the role. They'll never be Pericles, but if they could approach Pericles, if they could be that qualified of some sort, really that's what we have to do. We have to be that good, or we're going to blow it. So be careful how you vote. Thank you.
I don't know about everybody else, but you've kind of made me want to go back and get another degree from Hiram. So thank you for that. What a treat to have all three of you here tonight. There's no official format for how we're going to do Q&A. They said that they will self-manage, and I know as Hiram people we can all be civil and not talk over each other and whatnot, so we're just going to turn it over to the audience for Q&A. Thank you.
Do you want to?
I think you're in the middle. You should
I'm
call
in the
too.
middle?
Yeah.
Yes.
So going to Professor Bradabough's presentation, I think it's interesting that on one hand everybody says, well, George Washington said that he'd rather go to hell in a handbasket than to have political parties. But in your presentation, you advocate that these fissures within the parties are like the worst thing for the future leadership of our country. Is it like a matter of like it's too late to go back to a non-party system?
Absolutely. It's always been too late to go back to a system without political parties. James Madison and his contemporaries disliked political parties intensely, but in Federalist Number 10 and throughout the Federalist Papers, there is an acknowledgement of what the framers referred to as factions. Political parties today, we would use the term political parties and interest groups, are inevitable facets of a democratic political system. And what to me is most fascinating about Madison's evolving thinking on this issue is that by the time he is in the 1820s, and he's an older guy, and he's going to live to 1837, so he's going to outlive Jefferson and Adams and pretty much everybody else from the framing generation, is that he writes about the very positive role the political parties have played under this new democracy, and essentially he says, I was a nutty, crazy kid back in those revolutionary days and even up to the time of the framing of the Constitution, and now I have the experience of lived decades with a loyal party opposition challenging the party in power. This has been a good thing for American democracy. I, James Madison, was not perfect. I was in error, and I believe that the future of the Republic revolves around loyal political parties in opposition to one another with competing policy agendas. And indeed, I think he was very wise to concede that error in his thinking, and I think political parties have been the vehicle that has moved policy, has knitted the branches together when necessary to produce public policy. So there will always be political parties. The question is, will they be functional political parties? And right now we have one party that pretty much functions, and we have one party that can't function. I believe so. We have single-member districts in this country. If you finish second in a race for president or the Senate or the House or pretty much anything else, you get nothing. Ross Perot got 19% of the popular vote. 1 in 5 Americans voted for him in 1992. The great Theodore Roosevelt, coming out of retirement with his Bull Moose Party in 1912, got 28.5% of the popular vote. The Bull Moose Party died. Ross Perot's Reform Party died. That is the role of third parties in American democracy. They come along, their ideas are stolen, they flame out dramatically, and they go away. The only exception is if one of the two main political parties at a given time is so much in dire peril that it cannot continue, then it is supplanted by one of the new third parties. The Whigs in the 1850s died out, and Abraham Lincoln and the Young Republican establishment assumed the mantle of the second party in American politics, and it has been to this day. So that would be the only way I think that a third party could stick around for the long run. We don't have a parliamentary system where if you get 20% of the vote, you get 20% of the seats. So it would have to take the place, I think, of one of the two major political parties.
Do you think that the mass media, that the internet, my phone's blowing up right now, like everything, that the way that information spreads so rapidly right now, that the possibility of, another party dying the way that the Whigs did, like, is that just eliminated because information spreads so fast and all these crazy ideas get squashed so early?
So it's a very interesting question. I think that the challenge, if we were to look to sort of the reformation of the Republican Party after 2016, the challenge is, what would a new party look like? Where would it draw blocks of voters from? Which Democrats could it pick off? Which new voters could it bring in from the wings who are participating perhaps in a third party right now, whether that's the Libertarians or someone else? And I'll tell you, as an intellectual proposition, it is very hard to figure out how to design that new rising third party. It's very difficult. So that leads me to think that there will continue to be sort of internecine civil war within the Republican Party to crush one faction at some point and have one faction be the victor and therefore the standard bearer and the identity again of the Republican Party. But if it took Bill Clinton 8 years of constant toil, and he's a smart guy, if it took him 8 years to fix a very small strategic problem in the 1980s, I think we're looking at more time, more blood spilt, metaphorically speaking, in these intellectual wars within the Republican Party than was the case for the Democrats earlier.
Yes.
There was something in the Plain Dealer yesterday, just facts about voters in Cuyahoga County. I was surprised. It seemed like about 50% of the registered voters who were independent had not designated any party. And I was wondering if you understood anything about that or what's happening there.
So we are a more partisan country than at any time since the Civil War in the United States, although a not insignificant portion of Americans declare themselves as being independent. But here's what is very important compared to the label independent today compared to 1975 or 1980. If you ask a series of 5 follow-up questions to those people who say, oh, I'm independent, turns out, no, they're not. They're all either very decidedly Republicans or very decidedly Democrats who like to pretend that they're independent because it sounds neat. But when you get down to it, 5 to 7 or 8% of Americans could truly be called at this time independent and could be capable of voting a very mixed ballot in any given race. That's a lot different than it would have been, say, in 1976, when you could have had legitimately 20, 22, maybe even 25% of Americans not only say that they fall within the independent category, but then when you ask them the follow-up questions, turns out, yeah, they really are independent. So.
Yes.
With all 3 of you guys' presentations developing around national security, demographics, and the historical perspective, what we do not hear about in this election often is environmental policy. How do you guys think that if environmental issues continuing as they will affect demographics, national security, and the historical perspective that we look at?
Well, that's an interesting question. Again, historians don't usually make predictions. So, how do we say? Can you repeat the question? How will environmental changes affect?
Well, for you, how do you feel as if looking back at the past, gazing at the future, how do you feel that environmental policy and environmental changes will affect us?
Well, I really think that the millennial generation is become super aware of this as environmental issues as significant, particularly climate change. And so I think that there's going to be increasing pressure from younger voters to make this a centerpiece of national policy and to push us in that direction. And I think that will happen if Hillary Clinton is elected president. If Donald Trump is elected president, which I know you don't think is going to happen, but I mean, he did actually say, he said he didn't say this, but he did actually say that climate change was it was made up by the Chinese to depress our manufacturing. And that was in a tweet some time ago. So I don't know what he would do. I mean, it's kind of scary. But I think that there's a lot of pressure from, there's a great deal more awareness now among younger voters on this issue. I don't know, fight it out between, no, civilly discuss it between you.
Thank you. Professor Thompson, in your presentation, you discussed how Asia's premature move led to many of the nations in the region deciding to align with the United States. Yet recently, the Philippines has started a Chinese pivot. What are the reasons behind this?
Yeah, so everything I said, there are caveats, but I'm happy to explore each and every one of them. With this one, it's a really interesting topic. So this gentleman, Duterte, gets himself elected, and very strong populist appeal, very strong anti-drug appeal, and the thing that became particularly controversial was that he basically allowed people to gather together and go kill anyone they think might be involved in the drug trade. And apparently this is political dynamite because he is very popular in certain parts of the Philippines and overall still has pretty high popularity ratings. He also has said some really unpleasant things about President Obama, called him a son of a whore, told him he could go to hell, and has indicated in a number of respects that he's sick of the American relationship with the Philippines, that it's held the Philippines back, and they don't need the Americans telling them what to do. And, oh, by the way, those wonderful Chinese and Russians never tell me what to do in my own country. So why don't we go ally with them? So if I were to look to one issue in the Asian region that would be of real note in terms of needing careful calibration, it would be this issue. I would say the following things as a result of that. One, the core reason, aside from the fact that he doesn't like Barack Obama saying, you really shouldn't let people in your country go slaughter other people if they think they might be dealing drugs, aside from the fact he doesn't like to hear that, what's really behind Philippines' annoyance is that the United States has evidently, and I'm not an expert on that Filipino-American treaty history, but what they've been saying is they have a treaty with the United States that the United States is supposed to come and join with them to help it address Filipino issues. And the United States, in their view, hasn't lived up to that. And in particular, this means the Spratly Island, all that kind of business. They haven't fully come up to the plate to support the Filipinos. Well, if you're not going to support us, then why? If you're not going to come to us in our hour of need, the Filipino thinking goes, we should then less constrain ourselves in terms of working with you and try to strike other agreements, proactively engage the Chinese. That might not be, therefore, so much of a pivot that's going on as the Filipinos basically saying to the United States, if you really want to be our partner, you've got to be our partner. Duterte has said things along the lines of, I'm cutting the U.S. treaty in terms of doing, or arrangement in terms of doing joint military exercises. He's now retracted on that. He said, we're ending our military relationship with the United States. He's now retracted on that. What he has also said is that he doesn't intend to have another relationship with the Chinese like he's had with the Americans, which is to say a very subordinate relationship. He doesn't expect to just be in the Chinese pocket. He doesn't want to get too close to the Chinese. He is clearly playing the classical game of playing two giants off against each other. If I was in the U.S. administration, what I would say to the president is, okay, this is a guy who just got elected, therefore we have to deal with him in some fashion. This doesn't mean he's automatically going to the Chinese side by any stretch, and it also is a very strong indication, if I, James Thompson, were in this position to suggest to the president, I would say, of a following macro strategy, which is that we should dramatically draw down in the Middle East and dramatically scale up in Asia. But we should do so like Pericles, prudently and carefully, so that we set off a war in the process. That's what I'd say.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, there was one other. Okay, okay. Yes, go. Hello.
I am so sick of reading in the first paragraph of every comparison of the two candidates saying they're the least trustworthy people ever in this country. And, okay, we heard that for the last 6 months. Stop saying it. My mom happened, God rest her soul, to be a Goldwater Republican for the last 50 years. And she used to subscribe to this really awful right-wing publication. My mother was a loving Christian woman, and I said, why do you read this stuff, Mom? This is not right, called Human Events, which started tearing Hillary Clinton apart 30 years ago. So my question is, do any of you have a sense of why the Democratic Party wasn't listening to this and beating it back a little bit? Because I don't think Hillary herself was in a position to ever say, the American press hates me. I mean, she doesn't act like that, she just moves on with what she does. But is there something that the Democratic Party, knowing that she was ascendant, could have seen that would have at least countermanded some of that?
Well, the Bill and Hillary Clinton both have been attacked for a long time, and there's a legal organization that has been suing the Clintons over and over and over, mostly with ridiculous suits, but they're the ones that actually got some judges to go along with listening to their suits, which ended up leading to some of what's happened recently. And so, they're still there. They're still. Do you remember the name of this organization?
I don't.
Anyway, it's a conservative legal organization that's just going after the Clintons, and has been doing it for 30 years. And could the Democrats have countered? Well, they tried to, but There was just, it was this organization that prompted the Clintons to say there's a vast right-wing conspiracy going after us. And actually there was. I don't know if they were vast, but they were definitely going after them. I don't know how you counter it. How do you counter it? I mean, these kind of vicious attacks. Yes.
During the presentations, we covered race, gender, we covered education and economic status for voters, looking at these candidates and looking at the history of voting and the party system. I was curious, because I felt like that one of the missing aspects would be religion in that. I was curious as to why maybe that was skipped during this presentation. If you feel like it's important, if you feel like it's not important in the past, maybe not so important in the future, or vice versa.
I think it is important. I think it has definitely been important and I think that right now, I think evangelical Christians are in a difficult position because they don't like Donald Trump. I mean, he contradicts their values, and I think that I don't know what what they can do. I mean, some of them have said, "Well, I'm going to vote for Trump because of the Supreme Court," and others have. The Mormons have a candidate of their own out in Utah that many say they're going to vote for, which could lead to Hillary Clinton winning Utah for the first time ever?
Since 1964.
Oh, 1964. Okay, no. Since 1964. The rest is the same forever. But the Democratic coalition during the New Deal drew in Catholics and immigrants. It was a broad coalition, which is why they won for so many elections. A broad coalition of working class whites, Catholics, evangelical Protestants to some extent, but not quite as more immigrants really, and of different religions, Jews, and that coalition broke apart. And so you began to see many conservative Catholics going with the Republicans and more liberal Catholics going with the Democrats. Have you done any studies of religion and voter choice?
Well, so there are a couple of thoughts that are sort of swirling in listening to your answer to this question, which I think is a very good one, and the question itself I think is very provocative. But here I take sort of a comparative perspective. If you were to look at the politics of Australia or New Zealand, you're expected not to make arguments from religion no matter what your politics are. It's not legitimate. You don't get to say the Bible says this and it's God's truth and only I know it, and if you disagree you're wrong, and therefore I get to inject that into the body politic. It doesn't happen. The Census Bureau tells us that 22% of Americans have no formal association with a religious faith at this time. That is a very good thing, and that number is getting higher, and that's a very good thing for America, and we're going to become, in that sense, more European, more like the Nordic countries, and I see that as a real positive change for the Republic over a period of time. The degree to which rationality, weighing and measuring evidence, making logical argument becomes the staple by which we choose to associate ourselves in politics and by which we compete, I think that would be a very healthy, sort of salutary development over a period of time. I absolutely agree that evangelicals are in a tight spot at the present time because they don't really have a candidate in the race at this point. Donald Trump is a lot of things, but a representative of traditional values might not necessarily be on that list of things.
Oh, I think your hand was up. Oh, your hand was up first? Okay, go for it. Yes.
I'm sorry to step back on a question from quite some time ago, though, but I didn't get a chance to ask it. Actually, I think that at this time in America right now, we are more ripe than ever for a legitimate national third party that would challenge Republican and Democratic supremacy. Essentially, you have the complete collapse of mail media, you have the near collapse of newspaper media, and you have the beginning of the very soon end of the centralized television media, which is now going to be on everybody's phone and everything everywhere. Bernie Sanders had a $54,000 website, 8 employees, and a bus. And in 6 months, he raised $204 million with no single contribution being over 61. I think that whether it be the breakup of the Republican Party and the so-called Tea Party leaving, or the social progressives of the Democratic Party leaving, I see this in the next 8 years as the ripest time potentially in American history. Do you agree or disagree?
I think I agree only insofar as if it could replace a second party, then I think there's a route there. Otherwise, we're just not a parliamentary system. We're not going to be one. And I'm on all the email lists for all the candidates just because I like to read everybody's email, but I'm not so impressed by the Our Revolution emails I'm getting at the moment because I think the revolution's dead, at least for 4 years, and I don't think it's going to amount to much. I think that's really the only viable path for a third party. I don't think one's going to stick around and incubate over a long period of time. That's my suspicion anyway.
The structure of our system kind of pushes us into a two-party system because we have winner-take-all elections, as Doug was explaining earlier. So the parties have to be these broad umbrella parties. In order to win national elections, you have to have broad umbrella parties that bring together coalitions of voters of somewhat different views, sometimes very different views. And so in a way, I mean, any party that becomes too ideological one way or the other puts itself in a position where it's likely to simply lose, and because it can't bring in enough voters, which is why you tend to have a party usually that's kind of center-left and center-right, and they kind of balance each other out. But when I was younger, people used to say, oh, the two parties they're the same. And why are these parties so much the same? Well, there are structural reasons why they're the same in order to win elections.
Can I offer just one other thought on this? I'm an international relations guy. I'm not an expert in the parties, but something has really struck me about this election, and I've been sort of banding this theory about and defining it and developing it, and it is by no means fully developed, but I'll just throw this out for what it's worth, which is that when you think about how Trump really consolidated his initial base, he did it by being anti-immigrant and anti-free trade. Those are his things, which is to say an anti-globalist kind of perspective. If you look at what's going on right now in Britain, you have the people who are interested in global integration and so forth versus the people who very much are not and voted for Brexit. This seems to be part of a general trend, and I would say if you take it specifically in the United States case, you have two parties that both contain within themselves the strong anti-globalist and the strong globalist parts. You see this in the Republican side, you see this in the Democrat side. And that seems to me this election to be the stronger fissure between groups than left or right. That is the potent issue, is how you come down on that spectrum. And it seems to me that what we're looking at is potentially, if the parties are going to have integrity within themselves, and the central issue is, are you for these global initiatives and global engagement or not, something's going to have to happen with one of these parties claiming that mantle. Or they're going to both remain, at their core, fundamentally contradictory. Not just in tension, as they always are, but like self-contradictory. And if there were to be a new party arrangement, a new party that emerges, either a new party after one collapses or even a third party, the topic at the core of that, it seems to me, is, are you for the global thing or are you not for the global thing? And if I wanted to start a third party right now, if I wasn't not doing my Hiram College professor thing and various other things, I would probably go out and start a third party that's, we accept the global initiative and start trying to take people from the two parties, because there are plenty there who are not feeling at home in either of those parties right now.
Well, if they would only realize that the first prize should not be the presidency, and the first prize should be either a state legislature or even a congressional legislature representing a state, then they would win in 8 years easily, the presidency. But they always seem to go, no, we're going to run this person, whoever that is, and then we're going to go ahead and capture this 270 electoral majority, which is not possible. If they start to think like Uber, they'll dominate. The cab industry is going to be extinguished in 4 more years, and I would say 25% of all cars on the road are going to be driverless Uber versions of cars in another 15, maybe even 40%. If they would think the other way, which millennials seem to do, as opposed to Gen X people like me and John, they might be successful.
Somebody knew way back there.
If I may, I'm just saying something back in the room, I'm a lawyer, just standing when I talk. So here's my question. You kept mentioning that apocalyptic future that you keep telling us may happen should we elect a Republican this season?
Those who are experts in American policy?
Well, did we say that an apocalyptic future would happen if we elect a Republican?
Not verbatim, no.
The Supreme Court doesn't make foreign policy. I mean, there is so much that the president does that is outside the purview of the Supreme Court that I don't know that that appointing Supreme Court justices is going to keep in check whatever excesses we disagree with in whoever is the president. Maybe I didn't understand your question.
No, that's pretty much what I thought you said. Sadly.
Oh boy, how about you?
One of the criteria we used in comparing voters was education,
Mm-hmm.
and American education has evolved over the years, and the concept of what was highly educated and how many people were educated. And now that schools are splitting apart, even in elementary schools, into charter schools, and people are getting their information from the internet rather than going to Hiram College. What does being educated mean in the future, and how will that affect the election?
What a good question. Did you want to take that? You haven't answered it.
Here are a couple of thoughts. 20 Garfield presidency scholars and I just spent a week in Virginia looking at all things and all ideas Jeffersonian. And there they are right there. Hi, how are you? Good to see you. Yeah, there you go. Oh, yeah, all right. And one thing that came through again and again piercingly on that trip was the commitment of Jefferson and Madison to universal, high-quality, excellent public education for all Americans. Without it, the republic would not succeed. All of the framers to a person believed that a Republican form of government ultimately would collapse. It would either morph into some form of iron tyranny over here or rule of the mob and disastrous chaos over here. The question was, could you find the center and hold it long enough through an enlightened public that the institutions and the constitutional framework and artifice would last? I think we are so far from having that kind of system of education in the United States. I worked in education policy for 3 years in the District of Columbia at the Institute for Educational Leadership. And what I would say is that as a values proposition, I do not even believe that Americans really value education and educators, period. I just don't think they do. I don't think it's something to which we commit resources or is on the top of our agenda at any given time. I don't think that's likely to change anytime soon, which leads me to a second comment, which is that the huge gap between the brilliance of a James Madison and his understanding of what it took to frame a republic on the one hand, and Americans' sort of like 10th layer passing occasional appreciation of the fact that there's more to the Constitution, that there are those three branches. Gives me real pause and real worry. Much has been written in recent days and recent weeks about a portion of voters who are not empiricists. In other words, evidence doesn't matter. It's just you can have your opinions, but there's no link and no support necessary from evidence. And increasingly, I see that afoot on all parts of the political spectrum in the United States. I see it on the right, I see it on the left, and I see it all spread across the middle too. So all of that makes me very concerned about a sort of open door for creeping authoritarianism of one stripe or another, that people might give a license to any particular figure at a given time, make the deal. If you deliver some results, we'll give you what you like. You don't wake up with Julius Caesar on Thursday if things were perfect on Monday. It takes longer than that. But over a period of decades, of course, you can wake up with Caesar, or you can wake up with Caesar Augustus, and the Roman Senate can matter no more. So I take those things seriously, and I actually think that those things are not impossible in the future of the United States. Far from it. I think we're just as corruptible and subject to disaster as any republic or any democratic system, probably.
If you think about what everybody here learned at Hiram, we learned how to think, how to research, how to inquire, to consider how do we know what we think we know, to look at evidence, to consider other points of view, and not to simply shout them down, or denounce them or call people names because we don't agree with them. And it's that kind of inquiry that's crucial to a republic. And that's why a liberal arts education is so critical. We cannot let it go. I mean, we see people saying, oh, the humanities, who needs them? They don't get any jobs. Well, that's not the reason for the humanities, right? You know, and that's not the reason you study different subjects, why you do interdisciplinary study. It's crucial for our republic, and really, I think, for the future of the world, to have an educated citizenry that can really think and question and critique their own beliefs, our own beliefs, and look at ourselves critically. That was a plug for Hiram, but it's just a plug for liberal arts education generally.
We're in big trouble.
Yes, your hand was up earlier.
Professor Thompson, I was wondering if you could give your thoughts on Australia's role in China's strategic blunder as far as ideological beliefs, more in tune with the U.S.'s, but then increasingly stronger ties economically with China. And if that is
Can people hear? He's asking about Australia's role.
Always comes up, the Australian role. So I was just in Australia, so this is going to be the only real data I can bring to this. I'm not particularly an expert on Australia. In fact, my colleague, Professor Bradabo, is, so he might have more to say about this than I do. But I would say a couple of things. The first thing I would say, what I noticed when I was there, is I got off the plane and took the taxi into Sydney and got into my hotel, and it was me and all the people around me who looked like they were from China. I later found out my hotel was in Chinatown, so that I was like, okay, I'm going to recalibrate it. All of Australia is not Chinese, but a lot of it is. In fact, there is a huge Chinese population there, and I was there for an academic conference, and a professor who's very well thought of there and very prominent was saying that the Australian people have not yet woken up to what this actually represents as a geostrategic threat. The governments, to a certain degree, but the people not yet. The role of China and so forth. I would say two more quick things. One is that the Australians are always proud of pointing out that they've fought on every side of every major conflict with the Americans. And I don't think they're going to go ally with the Chinese against the Americans. In fact, that would truly be bad for my argument. The other thing is that the United States is using, I believe, parts of Australian territory to do its pivot to Asia. The Australians have this situation where they're, in many respects, the natural allies of the United States. And yet they're in Asia, and yet they're so, in certain ways, there's a barrier between them and a lot of Asian politics for a variety of reasons in terms of distance and cultural heritage and so forth. So I think that Australia will be important from a military point of view, from a point of view of providing a launching pad for U.S. initiatives. How much of a larger role it will play is not clear to me yet. And it's also the case that the economic relationship with China is very tight. If you want to bet, and I've recently lost a bet about Brexits, but I'm still willing to bet students on various things. I owe a whole class of people $1 because I didn't think Brexit was going to happen, including that guy over there. But I will bet you this, that if there were a major confrontation between Australia and between the United States and China and its allies in Asia, and Australia's economy was 80% dependent on the Chinese, it would ally with the United States. So,
I agree with that. I think that's exactly right.
Well, then it's true.
Your hand's been up for a while, I know.
Professor Thompson, you sort of answered this question a couple of times in a sense, but you've talked about this American Periclean necessity to engage in the world. What regions do you foresee the next president having to engage in? What regions and what manners? What's the future of this U.S. engagement?
So, right, you're right. I hinted at it. Let me elaborate upon it a little bit. And this is going to open up a Pandora's box, which I will not explore, but I'm happy to, as much as anybody wants me to. If I was in the position of if I was National Security Advisor to the next president, I would say to them that there is very little we can do, the United States, to stop what's happening in the Middle East. And there's very little that can be done for the next decade. And Israel is more secure than it's ever been. And the Iranians in their minds know that if they nuke Tel Aviv, the United States will nuke them. So we do not need to be there in any sort of capacity that we're there as we currently are. End the Fifth Fleet's basing in Bahrain, pull out of that naval situation there, take the fleet out, draw down the bases, and put all of that into Asia. But do it in a way that is careful and calibrated and doesn't start a war. So that would be the major move I'd make. Other than that, I would say continue to support European integration. Don't worry about Vladimir Putin except in the Arctic, which actually is a big thing, but very few people know that. And it's the only place he can really project force. And in terms of Latin America and so forth, we want stable democracies that are thriving, and we're in an opportunity to push that in a way that we never have before. So a cautious rearrangement of forces from those two regions. And other than that, I mean, there are a lot of other things I would say, but that would be the main move.
Do we have a moral responsibility to stop genocide?
We have as individuals, a calling to do what we can in this world. If it were to put U.S. troops and the future of this country's security at risk to stop a genocide, then that is not something that is obvious to me that we can do. Yeah.
Okay, Jack.
How do you view the Russians and the Iranians turning Syria into a satellite state and thereby threatening the existence not only of Israel, the Golan Heights, but also Turkey?
So by removing U.S. force from the Middle East, it raises 7 key questions, all relating to places. And you've raised 3 of those. So it raises questions about Israel, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. As you may gather, I have an answer to all of those. But I will just mention Syria in this regard. So, and how it relates to Russia and Iran. If you really wanted to screw up the Russians and the Iranians' capacity to project force around the world and do anything around the world for the next few decades, you'd leave them the Middle East. The idea of Iran managing the Arab world in any effective way, being able to control it, is just not plausible. People talk about if we leave, the Iranians will take over the Middle East. If they go try, that's all they're going to be doing until they give up, and eventually they'll give up. As for the Russians, I'd be more afraid of the Russian nuclear arsenal if I was in Russia. Other than that, in terms of the Russian capacity to project force, aside from the Arctic, I'm not concerned. And if they're going to get drawn into a boiling Middle East, this is a brutal calculus. But if you really want to damage the Russians, you'd say, go do what you want to do.
Mark.
Could you please further expand on the Russian presence in the Arctic, as well as Hillary Clinton's stance on drilling in the Arctic?
I could. I don't know if this is everything that everyone came here to listen to tonight, but I can. No, I know, but I feel like this is suddenly becoming about me, and I don't want to take over this. But so if either of you want to talk
about foreign policy.
Well, that's right. And if either of you want to talk about the Arctic, feel free. The first part was the Arctic threat. Was this? Okay. So I take this very seriously. I basically wrote a book about it, and I think it's reemerging. And so the one place where the Russians are really doing anything is in the Arctic region in terms of taking over that territory that's thawing. So that is a real threat. And the truth of the matter is you'll have to remind me about Hillary Clinton's policy on Arctic drilling. I don't recall it.
I believe she wants to ban Arctic drilling.
Okay. I don't know if that's a good idea. I don't know if it is. What I will tell you is this, that it is of U.S. strategic benefit, and by that I mean its ability to withdraw from the Middle East insofar as North America is energy self-sufficient. There are real costs to getting there, and maybe we don't want to pay those costs. And I'm not an oil expert, and I'm not an environmental expert, and if you gave me the data, I can't tell you which way I'd ultimately go on that one. But energy self-sufficiency in North America will give the United States tremendous latitude to pursue a policy that is in its global interest, and that's of note.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Since we've touched on the subject of energy, and I article was released recently by CNN. I can't remember the author, but it stated that the 21st century would be mainly about a term called climatees, which was refugees that come from climate or come from climate change. What would you think? What kind of effects do you think that would have on demographics or national security? I guess either one.
Oh, I think that the possible consequences of global climate change and refugees is very serious. I mean, I think that is a real prospect that this may occur. I mean, we're already seeing the effects of climate change now that some people deny, but I mean, that the weather extremes are becoming more extreme. I mean, storms are becoming more extreme. We've had I think the hottest year on record. We're about to finish up the hottest year on record, and I think that this is a real problem that may be coming. I don't know what to do about it, but I think it's I think there are going to be climate refugees.
How do you think it will affect U.S. demographics because of that?
I think it's very interesting. A city like Miami is already starting to get into trouble. It's going to be in huge trouble in 15, 20, and 25 years. Even New York City, the viability of New York City and the engineering feats that it will take to keep Manhattan at some point are going to perhaps become prohibitive. And that's sort of just the beginning of that phenomenon. So we have one recent example, which I think speaks to the possible political effects, when 150-some thousand people had to leave New Orleans permanently and never came back. Boy, did it change the politics of New Orleans. I mean, it's still corrupt, don't get me wrong. It messed up the balance between the two parties compared to what it had been before. So I think that kind of thing could be something that could, to one degree or another, repeat in different coastal areas of the United States at different times.
And people who criticize Ohio for having bad weather will suddenly find Ohio very desirable. Yes.
I feel like after, and this might strike some nerves, but going back to the election, I feel like in 2008 and since then there have been so many articles that mark different events as the death of the Republican Party. And I feel like there's this almost like vacuum left by the legacy of George Bush. That in 2008 we end up with a basic candidate, literally John McCain. Like so many people probably don't even remember who he is. And then in 2012 we have Mitt Romney, and it's kind of like, hey, don't forget about us. Like we know we know Obama's still gonna win, but like we're still here. And there's just like this legacy. And then we end up with Donald Trump. Do you think that that's going to continue to where in 2016, if he doesn't win, that there's going to be another Donald Trump? Or will
There could be.
Will this turn around to where every strong Republican is actually going to say, I can be the one to fix this part?
Well, a lot of those people, those 13 million voters who did vote for Donald Trump, they'll show up again in Republican primaries now. Even if they didn't 4 years or 8 years before, they'll show up 4 years from now because they're switched on, and they're going to conclude that they were screwed out of a victory and that it wasn't fair, right? It's not fair somehow. And so they're going to be there. And so take a Paul Ryan, who I assume still harbors presidential ambitions, or somebody who's sort of his ideological, relatively pragmatic bent, right? He's going to go out into primaries if he decides to run in 2020, and he's going to be out on the ground a year and a half ahead of time. And guess who he's going to run into? These same people. And so he's going to start to talk a pragmatic centrist game, and pretty soon he's not going to be able to talk a pragmatic centrist game. He'll lose primaries. Other people will jump into the gap and play with great demagoguery to the people who are showing up to vote. So I don't really expect that 2020 is the time at which a grand reformation champion of the Republican Party is going to emerge. I think this is a longer-term proposition than that, unfortunately. that is the question, I think, or at least it is one of the questions at the very least. I think if you press a Ted Cruz or one of the other, or Marco Rubio about that notion that because I did not drop out, Donald Trump was able to win, I don't know that they are sold on that, to be honest with you. And mathematically, they could cite some evidence to show that that's not true, because as the field did winnow, those supporters didn't all go to an establishment candidate or to a pragmatist. Some of them did break toward Trump. A significant fraction of them broke toward Trump. Where does that really leave us then? I think it leaves us with every candidate for himself again, probably. And even if they pay homage and lip service to the idea of a unified Republican Party, I'm not so sure that any one of them would be able or willing to be the sacrificial lamb to help achieve such a posited unity of some kind.
And has there ever been a situation like this, except for, like, maybe I could make an argument for the Bulldozers Party, that neither one of them wanted to give up that, ticket?
So I'm struggling with it a little bit. It's a very important and interesting question. I mean, I think you can make the argument that the Tea Party is a party unto itself. The Tea Party and others who go under the Liberty Caucus label, they're not Republicans, frankly. They're some other stripe. They are hell-bent on throwing sand and silverware into the gears of government to try to wreck it. They don't want it to work. They don't want it to function. They don't want us to govern. Anybody, not even the Republican Party, to govern. So in that sense, they're a third party. But the thing is, they're trapped under the Republican umbrella. And so I still think that leads to a cage match, a death match within the Republican Party over an extended period of time to really win out and control a party. I guess if I had to bet over a long period of time, I'd bet on some new brand of the establishment, but maybe that takes the better part of a decade. I don't know.
Do you think that the Democratic Party is going to have the same issue? I think in 2008, everybody could say that Hillary Clinton would be the Democratic candidate. Where do you see this going in 20 or 24?
So I referenced earlier that split between the Bernieites, right, and the establishment, and I think that the establishment has to be careful to find a way to not let that widen. But I would also say I'm looking for other candidates, say perhaps a Julian Castro, the Housing and Urban Development Secretary presently, but who's former mayor of San Antonio, Texas. I'm looking for someone like him to swoop in. If Hillary Clinton decides not to run for re-election, I think somebody like him could swoop in a very Obama-esque fashion and become sort of the new standard bearer of the Democratic Party. Or if she were to serve 2 terms, it could happen at the end of that. But I would very purposely and methodically cozy up to the rising demographic of Latinos that are going to be the real base of the Democratic Party, and I would cultivate that all across the southern tier states of the United States.
So you don't see such a vacuum in the Democratic Party that we were left with the Republicans after 2000?
I don't think it's impossible. I think it's significantly less likely just because of the nature of the division between the 2 wings of the Democratic Party.
I have a thought on the Republican Party. And I mean, I admit I don't want to offend anybody who's a Republican or a Trump supporter here, but I'm really, frankly, disturbed that a demagogue has become the nominee of a major political party. I don't recall this ever happening in this way before. And he really harnesses anger and a sense of we're against the other. I mean, there's an awful lot of passion against immigrants. I mean, the amount of passion against, and yet people say, well, we're only against the illegal ones, but the sense is that they're against all. I mean, the sense is just, it's scary if you're an immigrant. And there's a lot of passion against Muslim refugees coming into the United States. And it's this sense of the country's being invaded by the other, and the other are people that don't look like us. Their other are not white people. And that sentiment is very strong among that group of people, and it's a sizable number of people. And I think we have to do something to address that. There was something similar that happened in the 1920s. There was a strong nativist movement in the 1920s as a backlash against the massive immigration that had taken place for several decades before that from southern, central, and eastern Europe and Asia. And there was, the Ku Klux Klan rose again. And the Ku Klux Klan was not just targeting African Americans, they were targeting immigrants in particular, anybody who wasn't a native-born white Protestant. They targeted Catholics to get on the religious question. And this did not lead to the death of the Republic. This died away, but part of what happened, I think, is that in the 20s, people from different groups, ethnic groups, came to identify as Americans, and people began to see themselves as part of a common culture. And part of what I think caused that was the rise of mass media, radio, movies, people, sharing a common mass culture. And I really think we need to do something, I'm not sure what it is, to bring people together again so that people see themselves as sharing something in common rather than being at war with immigrants or, Muslims or we can't be at war with each other. And I think this is something we need to heal. We need to bridge that divide somehow. And I don't know how, but I think it's really important.
We've gotten the nod that we have one last question left.
Time. Oh, you haven't spoken. Go for it.
Sorry, I was just going to sort of follow up on that, which is, if you put this in a historical perspective of, is this, dire peril that we're in? This choice is going to have, be the end of America as we know it, as some pundits might tell you that it is, or everyone's going to move to Canada because they don't want to live here anymore. Historically, how does this compare? And I think you just touched on it a little bit to other inflection points we've had throughout our modern history.
Well, I guess you wouldn't call this modern history, but the point when things fell apart, when the Republic fell apart, was over slavery and the Civil War. And when Lincoln was elected president, South Carolina seceded, and the immediate catalyst was simply the election of Lincoln. So that's when it broke apart. That's when it didn't work, because the issue of slavery was too great to hold the party system together. The party system broke apart. And, both parties, the Republican Party was exclusively Northern. The Democratic Party split apart into a Southern Democratic Party and a Northern. And then there was the Constitutional Union Party, which popped up briefly. So it can happen over an issue that's really great. But I don't think we have an issue like slavery right now that's that great that's going to tear the Republic apart. I just don't see it. We've had times of tension. We've had times of massive immigration before. We're not really having massive immigration. In fact, immigrants are kind of going the other direction. But we've had times of massive immigration, and we've successfully held the Republic together. And I think that gives me hope. I don't really foresee the Republic falling apart.
I agree with that. I would just add one thing, which is while we are patting ourselves on the back for not falling apart, the Germans and others just get up and solve every problem that week that needs to be solved and make public policy and fix the environment and become the capital of green energy and 100 other things while we're sort of unable to legislate.
That's true.
And that's what really gives me concern. And I don't think that logjam breaks until after the 2020 census, when the redrawing of House districts kicks in 2022. I think the 2020s are probably going to be a period of very productive legislating, attacking the maldistribution of wealth and other things, but that's a while away. So if you like politics as they've been now for about 6 years, boy, you're really going to like the next 6 years or so, because I think our politics are going to look about that way.
I might just add as a final point, I'm thinking about I like how you put that inflection point where things seem like they might change. William Howard Taft, long ago, had a choice to make about whether or not to pursue a trade agreement, essentially, with the Canadians. And at the time, the Republicans were not particularly in favor of free trade. And William Howard Taft made a decision, and he said, I know this is going to kill me politically, and I know it's going to blow up the Republican Party for a while. That was literally his phrase. But it's the right thing to do in the interest of the United States. And he did it, and he got hurt, the Republican Party got hurt, and everybody survived. It reoriented the parties, and they got on with their lives. I suspect that our institutions are robust enough to repeat that. I'm not overly concerned that the Republic's going to fall apart tomorrow. I do have a profound sense of the importance of this Republic working well, and so I'd echo Doug Bradabough's point. It's not simply a question of collapse. It's a question of leadership globally, and we do need to assume that. And right now we're not in a position where we seem to be ready to do that fully.
How about a round of applause for our panelists? I'd like to give a special thanks to the City Club of Cleveland and the people who are working here tonight to welcome us. Thank you. Thank you to all of you for coming to this unique election-related event. We're flipping the script next week and doing a sports-related event. So if you're interested in Game 4 of the Indians, we're having 2 watch parties, one in Akron and one in Cleveland. So watch for an email coming out about that tomorrow.
Strangely, the same panelists, though. Go for it. I don't get that. I don't.
All right, have a good night, everybody. Thank you.